Good morning and welcome to the Havod Family Bible. I hope that this finds you happy and ready to come and listen to everything that we have to say. Today we are looking at the book of Joshua. Now, I know that some of you will be thinking, hang on, Phil, you've skipped a couple of books, and you'd be right. The book of Joshua does not follow on in the Bible directly from the book of Exodus. Between them, there are the books of the law, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And what I'm doing here is trying to just give you a shape of the story. We'll probably go back and look at the books of the law later and kind of go into them in quite a bit of detail. So they might take one or two videos to cover. The book of Joshua picks up after the death of Moses, with Joshua being appointed the head of the Israelites. This time, the Israelites are not wanderers, but warriors, seeking to step into the land beyond the Jordan and to take it by force. Across the Jordan, depicted here as a large river, though that river today dwindles to little more than a stream, they are led by the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark steps into the river, and the water builds up like a bank, very reminiscent of them crossing the Red Sea. While the Ark of the Covenant is in the river, the Israelites cross over on dry land. Now, the Ark is a box that contains the covenant. And we've talked about covenant before, a binding agreement between two parties, often of unequal power. And this agreement is between the Israelite people and Yahweh. The ark itself is a wooden box which contains the stone tablets that Moses carved in the presence of Yahweh. And they contain traditionally the Ten Commandments and other items of the law. Now, we don't know what happens to the ark. In reality, it kind of gets lost and disappears from the story, not in the book of Joshua, but in the book of Judges. So where it ends up, we're not really sure. And you've probably seen it used quite a bit in media. There's a lot of superstition around it, famously used at the end of one of the Indiana Jones films, touching the ark can only be done by priests, because anyone else that touches it suffers greatly, often being struck down dead. So that's the ark. Joshua, throughout the book, uses a few military tactics that are a little unusual and not quite what you would expect to be included in a holy book. There's very little heroism nor fighting great foes like we've seen in previous books, and we will see again a bit in Judges. For example, Joshua defeats the town of Jericho after a 7-day siege. Each day he walks around the city playing a trumpet, and then on the 7th day, walking around it 7 times, the army gives a great shout and the walls fall. The army charges in and lays waste to Jericho. The Bible, however, doesn't record them as capturing it, which you'd expect an invading army to do, especially if they're coming to take possession of the land. But rather destroying everything: men, women, cattle, sheep, everything. They keep the gold and the silver and the precious things for the treasury. One of the things that God said before they go into Jericho is that anything that isn't going into the treasury should be destroyed. Nobody should keep anything. However, the riches were too great a temptation for one of their members called Achan. They then decide to go up against the city of Ai. The first time they go up against the city of Ai, they are routed and 36 of the army dies. This causes a great distress amongst the people. And the person who did it, known is Achan, if you remember, is discovered, and he and everything he owns is taken to what is known as the Vale of Achor. And there he is stoned to death, and they raise over him a cairn of stones. Now we begin at this point to see a phrase that's repeated through the book, often after each of these episodes. It says that the cairn of stones is still there to this day, and it explains that this is how the Vale of Achor gets its name. We hear the same thing when it comes to the destruction of Ai. It is burnt and desolate and remains so to this day. Let's talk a little bit about the attack on Ai. Joshua uses a trick to defeat the people of Ai. He takes half the army and lies them in ambush, and then he takes the other half up against the city of Ai. They have a battle whereupon the army of Joshua are told to feign falling back, so that the people come out of the city of Ai to chase this army so that they will be no more. Joshua uses the blade of his dagger to signal those lying in ambush. And the army, now that it's out of Ai, have left the city defenseless, and the other half of the army go into the city of Ai and lay waste to it. They burn it to the ground, the people and everything that's in it. The army then sees the smoke rising from the city of Ai and realize that everything that they fight for has been lost, and that they're now trapped between two parts of the army. This leads them then to having a small problem of needing now to fight on two fronts, and of course the people of Ai are defeated. They are trapped between these two halves of the army, and the city of Ai remains desolate to this day. So already we've got a few clues in how we approach this book about how we understand how it's placed in our understanding of the text. For a start, the phrase "to this day" signifies that the text itself is written at some time after these invasions. Now, of course, "to this day" doesn't really give us a timeline. It doesn't say whether or not we're talking a generation or two generations. But obviously we are talking about some time passing between these events happening and the book being written. We've already heard of two great cities, and there are more that are destroyed in this sort of military campaign of Joshua. And of course, that is going to leave us with quite a bit of archaeological evidence. We're going to be able to find in these cities these destruction layers, because the city, it says, was utterly destroyed. So burning and destruction layers are often pretty clear when you look at when you dig down through archaeological layers. You can normally see layers of habitation, layers of destruction, layers of abandonment, all stratified in the earth. So we should very easily be able to look at this book of Joshua and go, here, this is our date. You're probably already getting the hint from the way I'm talking that we absolutely can't. And a lot of this runs into some of the problems that we talked about when we talked about Bishop Ussher. So the apparent setting of Joshua is the 13th century BCE, a time of widespread city destructions, but with a few exceptions of Hazor and Lachish. The destroyed cities that we see in the archaeological remains are not the ones mentioned in the Bible. Some of the cities that we see mentioned don't even show signs that they were even occupied at this sort of 13th century. Archaeologists generally agree that the Israelites had Canaanite origins, so they grew up out of the Canaanites and separated themselves as a people through a collection of myth-making and familial bonds. So if that's the case, then Joshua doesn't really fit into the narrative, even less so than the book of Exodus. As we begin looking, we find that pretty much all scholars kind of struggle with the idea that Joshua is actually based on a historical, factual event. And the prevailing scholarly account of the book of Joshua is that it's not a factual account. A lot of the names are problematic. A lot of the locations are problematic. And a lot of the timings are problematic. Joshua, however, does have this collection of stories idea that we spoke about, where we see a story being introduced, often with the phrase, the Lord said to Joshua, and ending with, and so it is to this day. Joshua then it becomes a book of telling tales about how things came about, how this great city has been destroyed, how Jericho, this city that obviously people remember in some way, has been wiped off the face of the earth and no longer extant. When we come then to look at the book of Joshua, if it's got no real historicity, how then can we explain or use the book as a theological resource? Joshua itself is very problematic because it actually has some items in it that are quite horrific. Now, we opened with the destruction of Jericho. And the destruction of Jericho is not, we burnt the city down. It's, we put everybody to the sword. We utterly wiped it. Women and children, non-combatants, are destroyed. And the same thing when we get to Ai. The city itself is destroyed. In later books in the Bible, not chronologically, but in later books, we see that what the sort of prevailing approach is that you take these people as slaves. If you are defeated by an opposing army, some of your members are taken as slaves. Other people get to live. A lot of it's based about the usual things. If you are pretty or useful, you're taken off as a slave. If you're not, you're left alone. Whereas here in Joshua, we're talking about utter destruction. An utter destruction that seems to be placed on the lips of Yahweh. What on earth do we do with that? I mean, we have to start from an absolute condemnation of of these kinds of actions. I would even say that this attack on Ai is very close to being a war crime. It's definitely not how you should do battle. By tricking the army to coming out and then attacking a defenseless city. So how then does Joshua get to be this great ruler? What is interesting is that as we get to about chapter 12, as the kind of campaign rounds up, even though that's only halfway through the book, we see the campaign kind of grind to a halt, and not all of the land that Yahweh has said go and take has been taken. Tribes fail to go out and take the land, and other things have to be done. The land gets redistributed, not around the original plan that we see outlined at the start of Joshua, but around a modified plan, so there is land for everybody. We begin to see here this very contracted land, so that this actions of Joshua are not successful. Now, it doesn't actually say why. There's a lot of blaming, and you get kind of this sort of slightly weird position where Joshua becomes very old, and the distributes of the country to the 9 tribes and the half tribe of Manasseh. And then we get that Moses gave them the land, which is a very odd phrase. We've been talking about Joshua in chapter 13. Let's just take a verse at random. Let's take verse 15. So Moses allotted territory to the tribe of the Reubenites, family by family. Their territory started from Aror, which is on the edge of the Wadi of Arnon, and the level land halfway along the Wadi, and included all of the tableland as far as Medeba, Heshbon and all its towns on the tableland, Dibon, Bamoth Baal, Beth Baal Meon, Jahaz, Kedmoth, Mephath, Kiranath, Sibmah, Zereth Shana, and the hills valley, Beth Peor and the watershed of Pisgah, and Beth Jeshimon, all the towns of the tableland, all the kingdom of Sihon and the Amorite king who ruled in Heshbon, whom Moses put to death, together with the princes of Midian, Evi, Rechem, Zor, Hur, and Reba, the vassals of Sihon who dwelt with the country. Balaam, son of Beor, who practiced augury, was among those whom the Israelites put to the sword. We're beginning to see a very confused account of who it was that is actually responsible for taking this land. Is it Moses? Is it Joshua? We're also getting quite an interesting collection of names. Now, one of the things when it comes to archaeology is that names often reflect an earlier time. And we can see in these names is that they have yet to be added with an Israelite gloss. They've yet to be renamed, because we even have, let me see if I can find it again for you, Bamoth Baal. So Baal meaning lords, often lords of the Canaanite gods. So Bamoth Baal would be the town of the lord of Bamoth. And Beth Baal Meon, again, the town of the lord of Meon. So we're beginning to see here these towns being very rooted in Canaanite theology, Canaanite understanding. So we then have this very confused book, which we can't date, which seeks to explain why certain towns were abandoned, why certain actions of Joshua weren't complete, while the people who were reading Joshua weren't looking at a completed territory that they believed to be theirs. Now, there are many reasons why this could be. It could be that it's written, as a lot of people seem to suggest, coming together in about the 7th or 6th centuries BCE, and it's part of the self-mythos making of Josiah, giving it to sort of their own creation myth, that Joshua says, look, our great ancestor took this land, so we can take this land too. This land belongs to us by right of former conquest. It could be that a lot of these tales, because they have a very formulaic way of being put together, are collections of tales that were floating around, that were gathered together. We see, as we see this sort of move from Joshua to Moses, that kind of you've got from maybe chapter 2 to chapter 12, where we're talking about this sort of military hero Joshua. We then have quite a bit talking about the allocation of land. We get some of the laws explained. For example, you get the explanation of refuge cities. So cities of refuge in the Bible are cities where, if you kill somebody accidentally, you can run to that city and you can see the elders at the gate and you can say to them, look, I didn't mean to kill this person, please let me in. If your explanation is strong enough, then the city will let you in, where you can live in the city until such time as a big formal trial can be held. Because obviously the law of Israel was that it was, at the time, an eye for an eye, which means that if you killed somebody, then they have a right to, then their family has a right to take vengeance on you. So this was a way of ensuring that there was no miscarriage of justice. We also get, as we go through it, we get long treaties of Joshua saying goodbye, how he tells the people to follow God, to keep God in their hearts before he is buried, and we find out what happens to the bones of Joseph, which have been brought out of Egypt, and they are laid together in the hill country along with Elzar, son of Aaron, and we get a lot of burial places of a lot of the important names. And actually, when you begin to take the book of Joshua apart, it seems to be a kind of a collection of stories remembered that have been put together, probably rewritten to fit this overall narrative. And it's not the only place we see it. It is perhaps the most complicated place to try and take apart, but we will see the same process being done in Judges. However, in Judges, there's very little change of the original story, unlike what we see in Joshua. So we then need to ask ourselves, what role does Joshua play in this holy book? It has two roles. It shows the power of Yahweh in that the Israelites only win battles when Yahweh is with them. And Yahweh is only with them when they uphold the covenant. We see that clearly in the invasion of Ai, where they don't win because Achan has kept that treasure, which has been against the commandment of Yahweh. They get rid of Achan, they appease Yahweh, they say sorry. When they go up against Ai, this time they win because the Lord has gone ahead of them. So of course, you could argue they win because they used a rather interesting military tactic. It is also a book that is used to codify these military tactics. And it's not the only place that we see military victories being ways of assuring the avoidance of military defeat. When we start looking at other great military battles, we see these same kind of warnings. So if you were a great king reading this maybe in the 10th century, perhaps in the 9th century, you're still facing the same kind of battle. However, you're also going to know that you're not going to leave your city undefended, just in case somebody pulls the same stunt that they see in Ai. So you're going to remember that story, and in order to avoid the same destruction, you're going to keep a military force in your city. So they codify in story form, in the way that you can teach person to person, how not to lose at war. And at the time, this was vital because kingdoms rise and fall pretty much every generation. They're not great kingdoms, so we're not talking 3 or 4 cities. Kingdoms here could literally be a hilltop. It could be kind of a hilltop and a collection of brothers and perhaps even sisters, as we explore when we get to Judges, working together to protect an area. So you need a way of making sure that this military information isn't lost. You also get out of it the primacy of Yahweh. Cities like Jericho and Ai, being in Canaanite territory, would have had their own deities. And these cities fall to the primacy of Yahweh. And as we've said before, the attack on the city and the fall of the city essentially equates to the fall of the deity of that city. The deity of Ai fell at the hands of Yahweh. These battles often work in two ways. You have a battle in the mortal realm and a battle in the divine realm, with deities fighting deities, and obviously in this one, Yahweh is successful. The Bible doesn't record a lot of that sort of divine battle in the books itself, but we see glimmers of it in the Psalms, where we hear Yahweh went out in battle and he fought. The Yahweh went ahead of the troops, and in his mighty power, with his bow, with his sword, he struck down the opposing foe. So we see this kind of imagery in the poetry of the Psalms. If Joshua is put together later, then a lot of that stuff would feel quite uncomfortable to a sort of a well-read or well-written a person, because you wouldn't want to include things about Yahweh that you couldn't tell for certain, because that was one sure way of annoying a deity, was of trying to do things that the deity hadn't actually told you to do. Which I think all of these pointers point to Joshua as we have it being a much later book. Now, just because it was put together later doesn't mean that we don't have stories here that are ancient. I would say that the stories of Ai, of Jericho, and like a lot of scholars, the first kind of 12 chapters, and even some of the poetry that we see dotted through, are probably ancient. I don't think it comes from when it is designed from the 13th century. I think rather that these stories come about maybe in the 11th century, perhaps even as late as the 10th, as people look at the destruction of the cities around them, as they're beginning to put together their own cultural identity. They're beginning to be the people of Israel as distinct and opposed to the Canaanites, the Egyptians, and the Philistines. And they're looking at the destructions of these great cities, which are still mostly there. A lot of the stone will have been taken to build houses. But you want to know, well, why are they destroyed? Who destroyed them? And saying the story of your own people to say, oh yeah, Joshua destroyed that, gives you an explanation for the destruction of the city, explains why the city is still destroyed because Yahweh doesn't want it rebuilt, and explains where you are now, how you came to be this nation. I then think that the book of Joshua was then expanded probably in the 8th, 7th, 6th centuries to the final form that we have it today. Perhaps, as some scholars suggest, even after the exile, as a way of kind of saying, look, this land belongs to us. It is okay for us to kind of take it back. But I think that when we approach the book of Joshua, we need to be very careful about that, because it says that it's more about protecting a nationhood rather than the coming into existence of a nationhood. So it's a much more political book than we've seen so far. There is still things we can take from it. And I don't think that there is a problem with us looking at some of the things that happen in the Bible and say, look, okay, that's a bit off. That is not how we as Christians would respond to something. That's not how we believe that Christ would want to respond to that action. And to say that there needs to be a better way. That if these things are recorded, they are recorded as ways of teaching us. And some of the ways in which it can teach us is to say, that's stupid, let's not do that again. The Bible, I think, is very much full of that. We see these military conquests of Joshua as trying to paint a hero which, for the time, would have been great. It just hasn't aged well. And in our modern world, we can look back at some of the great films of the 50s and 60s, and if you go back and rewatch them, you will see that it doesn't really age as well as we would like, and we haven't really dealt with our past as well as we would have liked. And I think Joshua is one of those books. Now, I know that there's going to be quite a bit of backlash against that, because there are some people out there that still want to hold on to the historicity of Joshua. Unfortunately, the archaeology is currently against the historicity of Joshua. There are some people that will still try and place it all in the same time frame, but I think that the closest that you're going to get is to be able to say that Joshua is a Christmas tree person. That what we see is the destruction of these towns, if they are done by Israelite kings, which I think is probably a bit of a stretch, because I'm not sure we had a nation of Israel when these cities were destroyed, but if they were done by spiritual ancestors, say, of the people that eventually become Israelite, that Joshua has had these stories attached to him. So we're not talking about a single band in history, but maybe over 200 years, the people who actually did that, their names have been lost, and they become attributed to the great hero of Joshua. We've seen it happen before with Moses. I think that is the most likely explanation of how Joshua came about, that all of these great battles are attributed to him. So we'll be taking all of what we've learned in the book of Joshua, and we're going to be looking next at one of my favourite books, which is the book of Judges, where we're going to do, hopefully, and we've looked a little bit at the gloss in Judges before, but we're going to kind of try to drill down and look at some of the really interesting stuff in the book of Judges. But we'll be doing that in our next video. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope that you have enjoyed this video and that you have found it useful and helpful. Please remember that these videos are produced because I enjoy doing them, basically. Wish I had more time to put more effort into them, in all honesty. But we produce them to help you understand the Bible, to help you understand our faith, to know where it is that we're coming from. So if you want to know more about who we are and what we do, have a look at our website, at our Twitter, at our Facebook. Sign up to our newsletter to see what kind of things we're doing in your local community. And of course, these videos are produced for free at the cost of basically us. So if you want to support us both in producing these videos or indeed in producing, keeping our mission going to the local community, please do consider sending us a donation. And you can do that through PayPal or through Gift Direct. Please remember to like and subscribe to our channel, which you can see just down below this video, because every subscribe helps us to know that these videos are making a difference. And remember, whatever you're doing this week, look after yourselves. Remember to wash your hands, try not to touch your face, keep social distancing, wear a mask, and stay home if at all possible. And whatever you do, stay safe and go with God. Amen.